Yeah, we'll get started. We got a few people here. My name is Max Abu-Laban. I am a member of the Acadia Communist Club, which organizes this event. I'm a co-organizer along with Max Gustafson and Katie Winters, who are in this call, and they'll be participating later on. Happy St. Paddy's Day for those of you celebrating, and thank you all for being here. And before we get any further into the evening, I'd like to acknowledge that this event is being hosted on Mi'kmaq, the traditional and unceded territory, unceded lands and waters of the Mi'kmaq people and all their ancestors. I know, Dimitri, you're in Montreal. I'm here in Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. We also want to recognize, in keeping with this event and the history in Nova Scotia, the toxic and ongoing legacies of environmental racism in Nova Scotia against the African Nova Scotian community, who has been contributing richly to the province for over 400 years. I want to first of all thank Dimitri Lascaris for coming here tonight. We're really excited to have you here, Dimitri, speaking to our community, students, staff, faculty, and people from elsewhere. I want to say thank you to Ruvimbo Chipazi, who will be moderating for the night. After this introduction, I'll turn it over to her, and she'll be facilitating the rest of the conversation. Also want to say a thank you to the departments of sociology, environmental sustainability studies, history, and politics for their support of this event. And in particular, I want to say thank you to Dr. David Duke, who has been a longtime mentor of the Acadia Communist Club and provided some support for this event. And most importantly, he encouraged all of his students to come to this event for their first year class, Environmental Perspectives. And that was a class that I was in exactly 2 years ago, as well as Max Gustafson, my comrade. And yeah, it's pretty cool that you guys are here. Just want to say, organizing events like this, you guys can do it too. That's my message for all the people in the younger years at Acadia. It's not that hard. I mean, Dimitri made it easy, but yeah. So I guess I'll speak a little bit about the Acadia Communist Club before introducing Dimitri and Ruvimbo. So the ACC, for short, Acadia Communist Club, was ratified under the Acadia Students' Union in 2019 with the mission of informing Acadia students of leftist perspectives and really trying to facilitate and strive for a community that combats oppression in all its forms, be a part of that. And last year, we ran a campaign. We launched a campaign, the Acadia for Labor campaign, because we saw that workers on this campus were underrepresented, underpaid, disrespected by the administration, by the companies, the contractors that are paying them and employing them on our school. So we got about 300 signatures, and our concerns, our demands are currently being heard by the administration right now. Our information is on the website of the Acadia Students' Union. If you ever want to get involved, we will be organizing in person next semester. So first of all, I'll introduce Ruvimbo Chipazi, who was supposed to be debating on our side for a capitalism versus Marxism debate last semester at the student bar, which we were organizing. Fortunately, got canceled because of COVID, but we're very happy that she's here tonight. She's an Acadia graduate and the former editor-in-chief for the Athenaeum newspaper, the student newspaper at our campus. And Dimitri, our special guest of the evening, he's an activist, a journalist, a lawyer, an eco-socialist, someone who we respect deeply, whose opinions we're really looking forward to hearing more about. He started his career as a lawyer on Wall Street, of all places, representing financial institutions to the likes of Goldman Sachs. And needless to say, that's not Dimitri anymore. He he currently continues his legal work pro bono and devotes himself to advocacy. He presented the Toronto 350's petition for divestment to the University of Toronto administration, the president, which is something we're actually working on here at Acadia, so it's of particular importance. And he served as the justice critic in the shadow cabinet for the Green Party. And I first met Dimitri back in the summer when he was running for the leadership of the Green Party, and he was on the campaign trail. And he ran as an anti-establishment candidate. He ran, with strong headwinds from the party itself. And I just remember really being taken by the fact that Dimitri was willing to say the things and go the places that others weren't. While others were sort of trying to accommodate capitalism into solving the climate crisis, Dimitri was talking about the need for eco-socialist futures. When others were criticizing the human rights abuses of official enemies of the West, Dimitri was standing up for Palestinians. He was standing up for those in South America who have been impacted by imperialist coups, and really just standing up for those people who aren't represented otherwise. So it's an absolute pleasure to have Dimitri here. We're looking forward to tonight. And without further ado, Dimitri Lascaris. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max. It was very gracious of you to offer those kind remarks. I'm coming to you from the unceded territory of the Ganyangahaga people in what is now referred to by settlers here as Old Montreal. And I'm privileged to live and work on the land of which they are the true custodians. I'm going to, first of all, I guess, turn it over to Ruvimbo. And I just want to say, I think I saw somewhere out there Linda Shaven, whom I know well, and I wanted to say hello to her. And there may be others in this conversation whom I know as well. If I've missed you, I'm sorry about that. But I'm really looking forward to the conversation tonight. And we can go wherever Ruvimbo would like to take it. So hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm very grateful for this honor. I honestly had forgotten about the debate, but I'm so happy that you reached out. And I'm just going to go over how I planned for it to kind of go. There are 6 topics, questions centered around 6 topics. And I'm thinking of devoting around 11 to 12 minutes for each discussion, with 1 to 3 minutes in case people want to add some questions after each topic. But there will be time at the end of all this discussion for open questions. And if you do have a question, you can either submit it in the chat or by raising your hand. And if you want to speak, Max will unmute you. Yes. Oh, that's good. Okay, so the first topic would be capitalism and climate and the climate crisis. And a major question is, what does it mean to be an eco-socialist? And what do you fight for?
So, as I've said many times, there's no one, and this was something that was shared with me by a highly respected Canadian eco-socialist. He said to me during the leadership campaign, we were talking about, the way the media portrays socialism in this country. And what does it really mean in the public's mind? And he said to me, Dimitri, nobody has a patent on socialism or eco-socialism. So it can mean a variety of things. First of all, I start by looking at it in terms of outcomes. So any kind of political system that is socialist would have the following outcomes. First of all, there would be no poverty at all. And in fact, the most vulnerable members of society would be prioritized by the government and by society at large. There would be no homelessness. A truly socialist society would be fully demilitarized, would always prefer the path of diplomacy and peaceful coexistence to the use of brute force, would avoid war at all costs and only as a last resort and only to the minimum extent necessary in order to defend the legitimate interests of the people. An eco-socialist society would be profoundly respectful of Mother Earth and would organize its economy in a way that is fully sustainable and fully respectful of the countless forms of life with which we share this precious planet. An eco-socialist society would be utterly intolerant of racism, insidious racism, explicit racism, systemic racism, or individual racism, and would prioritize, again, the interests of those who have been racialized historically. And these are sort of the broad strokes of what an eco-socialist society would look like. How we get there is by maximum democratization. And that means not only democratization, I mean, even at a purely political and electoral level, we don't really have a democracy in this country. We have what I would call a quasi-democracy. So first of all, we have a first past the post system, which is anti-democratic for reasons that I don't think I need to explain on this call. Secondly, campaign finance is largely the function of the wealthy, and the wealthy will always prefer and devote their resources primarily to those parties that will defend their interests. And so those who don't have the ability to finance campaigns are profoundly disadvantaged. We also have a media ecosystem in this country which is dominated by a few large corporations who have no interest in democracy. Their interest is in enhancing the power and privileges of their owners. And without a robust independent democracy, media, you cannot have informed consent among the citizenry, and without informed consent, you cannot have democracy. So even looking at it from the purely from the standpoint of electoral politics, we don't have a real democracy for those and other reasons. But moreover, and this is something which I think was explained brilliantly by a socialist economist by the name of Richard Wolff recently, we don't have democratization in the workplace. And it's remarkable that, you know, where the place where we spend, arguably those of us who work full time, the majority of our waking day. I mean, if you add into the equation not only the time you spend working, but the time you spend traveling to work, preparing for work, recovering from work, the majority of our waking day is actually committed to work, to gainful employment, those of us who are fortunate enough to have a job in this society. And the workplace is as hierarchical, generally speaking, as hierarchical a form of organization as one could possibly imagine. The workers, the ones who are actually producing the goods and services that make the corporation profitable, have almost no say whatsoever in how the workplace is organized, what they produce, what they do with the surplus of their labor, the conditions in which they work. And how can you have a real democracy where you carve out of the day-to-day lives of our citizens a space, the workspace, which is as anti-democratic, as undemocratic as one could possibly imagine. So in an eco-socialist society, in order to achieve the kind of society I've described, you would have to fully democratize the workplace. And that means worker cooperatives. That doesn't mean top-down, you know, state-owned enterprises where bureaucrats in Ottawa are telling the workers what to do. It means that workers would actually decide how the organization will be run, what they will produce, what will be done with their surplus, how the compensation will be spread amongst both managerial staff and people at the production level. So unless and until we have that, we don't have democracy. And in order to have an eco-socialist society, we must have that. It's absolutely critical. We have not yet seen in the world, up until this point in time, a truly eco-socialist society. We haven't even gotten close. There have been experiments in socialism. There have been experiments in socialism in places, of course, like the Soviet Union and Cuba, Venezuela. And there have been some good things that emerged from those experiments and some bad things that emerged from those experiments, but they were highly flawed experiments from which we should draw important lessons. And the number one lesson to my mind is that the workplace must be fully democratized. So I hope I didn't, you know, take up too much time in explaining my broad view of eco-socialism, but that's about as well as I can sum it up in a few minutes.
No, not at all. It is a very broad question. So thank you so much. Just from what you were just saying, I just thought of a question. One major issue that a lot of people I feel think about is financing. And when you talk about getting rid of poverty, which is a huge problem in any country, what are some ideas or stepping stones that you think can work towards that goal?
Well, I think really to effectively address the issue of poverty, I mean, we have to engage in some really fundamental analysis of the way we organize government finance. So we have been led to believe that a government from a fiscal perspective is analogous to a household. And so therefore it should always strive in the long run to balance its budget. Okay, this is nonsense. Governments, especially and particularly those who control their own currency, as Canada does, are not even remotely analogous to households or to businesses or to individuals from a fiscal perspective. Why? First of all, governments have the power to tax. You can simply pass a law and appropriate from those who have the ability to contribute as much money as is needed in order to fund social programs. Secondly, the government has a gigantic asset base. It has the largest asset base of any actor in our economy. And therefore, what this means sort of from a borrowing perspective is that it can borrow money at rates of interest that are far below the rates of interest that people in the private sector are required to pay, because they're riskier credits. The government is the least risky credit, so it can borrow money to the extent it has to, and I'm going to get to that in a second, at extremely low rates of interest. But thirdly, because Canada has control of its own currency, it does not actually need to borrow money. The Bank of Canada can create currency. Now, the counter argument to that historically has been that this, the creation of large amounts of currency will generate hyperinflation or excess inflation. But in fact, that's only true, and economic experience has proven this in spades. That's only true where the economy is operating at full capacity, which is rarely the case, and it certainly is not the case today, nor has it been the case for some time. Now, during the pandemic, the Canadian economy is operating well below full capacity. If anything, there's a risk of deflation rather than hyperinflation. We're more likely to see prices decline because of the economic conditions than we are to see soaring inflation. And therefore, the government should be using the printing press. It's actually not printing money. They just basically hit a button on a computer and they create vast amounts of currency. It should be liberally engaging in currency creation in order to fund social programs. Once we reimagine the spending capacity of the government, then the solution to poverty is very simple. The fiscal capacity is there, and we can provide people with a guaranteed basic income very simply. And that in itself will have not just the humane benefits of enabling people to live a dignified life and realize their potential, but there's economic benefits because people at the lower end of the income scale spend a much higher proportion of their income than the wealthy because they have to. They have to spend it on things like food, like clothing, like rent. And so this stimulates economic activity. So it's not just the humane thing to do, it's the economically sensible thing to do. And so I think once we've come to terms with the true and immense spending capacity of the government, which we've seen in this pandemic, the government has marshaled something in excess of, I think, $300 billion in a matter of months in order to sustain the economy during an unprecedented public health crisis in the post-World War II period. And there isn't a hint of inflation. Creditors are not demanding that Canada, pony up much higher rates of interest than it's been historically paying. Interest on government bonds is still at rock bottom levels. So I think that's the solution, and it's a very simple solution. All that's lacking is the political will.
Okay. What are your thoughts on green capitalism, and do you think that it would be able to address the climate crisis at the root of its problem in a meaningful way?
No, there's no such thing as green capitalism. It's as real as the unicorn, and it was a fiction that was deprived in order to perpetuate this profoundly unsustainable and unjust economic system that we have. The nature of capitalism is such that because it encourages the maximization of individual wealth, prioritizes that. What it does is it incentivizes people to externalize the costs of their production. So we've been seeing this. The environment has been ravaged by corporate actors who have foisted upon the population and future generations the cost of their economic activity while appropriating to themselves the profits from that economic activity. That's in the very nature of capitalism. And then once these these elites who externalize their costs and acquire massive amounts of wealth, what they do with that money is they manipulate public opinion and the dissemination of information in order to prevent the types of social and political change that we need in order to bring an end to the destruction of the environment. They do this by funding think tanks like the Heartland Institute, a climate change denying organization in the United States, or the Fraser Institute. They do this by buying, the ultra wealthy will buy large media organizations like Post Media, which is controlled by a right-wing hedge fund in the United States, and is the largest newspaper publisher in Canada, and gives space to people like Rex Murphy to peddle climate denialism, even in the current crisis that we confront. So unless and until we, again, democratize our economy, socialize our economy, transform it into something radically different from the capitalist system that we now have, we will not be able to save this planet. We will not bring an end to the ecocide that is unfolding before our eyes. And we have to have the courage to admit this. Unless and until we do, we're going to see a continued rapid decline in the conditions in which we live.
Thank you. I'd like to now open the floor to any questions which you may have from anybody who's listening. And if not, we can move to the next topic. Oh, there's a question.
Hi there, Dimitri. This is, sorry, Edith Callahan. I'm cooking my dinner as I'm listening to you talk. And I'm on the last day of my self-isolation, so I'm feeling pretty good. But thanks for everything that you've said so far. I'm actually from the School of Business, and Monday night I gave a lecture that said a lot very similar to what you said. It was on climate change and business, and I was saying, think of the nature of business. They are not going to solve climate change, not at all. But the specific question I have for you, because you were talking about financing a bit, and I don't know anything about Bitcoin really, but I'm wondering if you have some thoughts about that, because what I've heard people say from finance is, oh, it's going to be the democratization of finance and blah, blah, blah. But I frankly just don't trust it, but I don't know enough about it to speak intelligently on it. Do you have any ideas about that?
Well, a lot of people have raised Bitcoin with me over the years, and my knowledge of it is quite superficial. What I can say, without great authority, just my superficial knowledge of it, is that the volatility, you know, as Max indicated at the outset, I started my career on Wall Street, and you know, one thing I learned very quickly doing securities law and representing participants in the securities markets was that you know, you tend to see huge levels of volatility when there are informational deficiencies in the marketplace. So I think a lot of people are putting their money into Bitcoin without really understanding what they're doing, without really understanding the risks to which they are being subjected. And this is why you see these wild fluctuations in the value of Bitcoin. Beyond that, I really can't offer much more insight than that. As I said, my knowledge is superficial. I avoid Bitcoin like the plague myself. I don't invest in anything that I don't really understand. I understand the markets well, and that's why I tend not to invest in them either, because I think they're characterized by massive fraud. So.
Thank you for that question. Are there any more questions? If not, we will move on to the next topic, which is decolonization in Canada. Your campaign for the Green Party of Canada leadership was endorsed by Sylvia McAdam Seizenwaham, a co-founder of the Aldil No More, which is a prominent movement for Indigenous sovereignty, and liberation. Why did she endorse you for leadership? And what do radical futures of decolonization look like?
You know, I don't want to speak for Sylvia. I was greatly honored to have her endorsement. I suspect it had to do primarily with two aspects of our platform, and they are the following. First and foremost, we advocated for a legislated veto right conferred upon all Indigenous communities in this country. What we currently have is a legal system, which obliges the government and private actors, to the extent they're impinging upon the lands of Indigenous peoples, to consult with them in good faith. And if they're judged by the courts to have consulted in good faith, and even then, oftentimes the courts don't actually oblige them to do that, but in theory, that's what they're supposed to do. Then, if the Indigenous community says, no, we don't want your project on our lands, it's too bad for the Indigenous community. The only obligation on the government and private actors is the obligation of consultation. We took the position that we have to go much further, and that is grant to Indigenous people an absolute veto right over the exploitation of their land and resources. If we did that, the amount, I mean, two things would immediately happen. They would have so much leverage in their negotiations with the government and with corporations in terms of resource exploitation that they would get a much larger share of the wealth that is generated by the extractive sector, to the extent that they actually want to do business with the extractive sector. And secondly, in a lot of cases, they would just say, no, there's no amount of money we're willing to be paid in order to allow you to exploit our land and resources, because the long-term effects are going to be catastrophic. And so this would have wonderful impacts on the condition of the environment in Canada. But first and foremost, it would finally confer upon the Indigenous peoples of living in what we now call Canada, the dignified life, which they have been deprived of by this settler society for so long. So the number one thing that I think we have to do in order to realize the dream of Indigenous sovereignty and rights is confer upon them a legislated right of veto. And secondly, the other thing that I advocated for, which I suspect Sylvia was quite supportive of, was the idea that we should allocate to Indigenous communities a fixed percentage of GDP every year, so that they're not, first of all, and it should be substantial enough to actually enable them, to have clean water, to have proper health care and mental health care available to them at all times, to deal with, security, the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, and it's one that we're far from having resolved in this country. So we would legislate that every year they'd have a fixed percentage of GDP transferred to them by the government, which would be spent in whatever manner the Indigenous communities wanted to spend it. We would not control the way in which they spent that. I think that those two elements, the right of veto and a substantial predictable source of income that fluctuates with Canada's GDP, but not with the political winds of the moment, those are absolutely key to realizing the dream of Indigenous sovereignty. So I would imagine that had a lot to do with Sylvia's endorsement.
Thank you. Since this is a discussion that's trying to inform university students, what do you think? What is a positive role that universities can play in decolonizing Canada, if they can do so?
Well, there's so much. I think, first of all, I think universities need to do a better job of explaining the history of racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the oppression of Indigenous peoples in this country. Really, that has to start at the very beginning of one's education in this country, when children are younger. Universities are doing a relatively good job, I think, compared to primary schools and secondary schools in Canada. But all levels of education have to, this should be an essential component, actually, of public education. Enlightening our children and our young adults about the full extent and nature of anti-Indigenous racism, both historically and in the current time. And secondly, we have to identify in educational programs at all levels of education the true culprit. Why is it that Indigenous persons have been so oppressed? It's capitalism at the end of the day. In fact, ultimately, that is the main reason why any group has been historically oppressed: capitalism. Racism is more a tool rather than, it's a mechanism that capitalists employ in order to divide the people, prevent them from uniting, create scapegoats, distract their attention away from their real enemy, which is the wealthy capitalist. So this is something that's absolutely essential to teaching our young people, and I think universities have an important role to play, as all levels of education do in that regard.
Thank you. I'd like to open the floor to any questions that our guests may have.
I see a hand up, Sophia Munoz.
Yes.
Can I unmute myself? Am I good to do that? Okay.
Yes, no worries.
Perfect. I guess that this is just, it made me think of it when you were talking about kind of like remaking the Canadian government's relationship with Indigenous peoples. And I was just wondering, like, do you think that that would mean reframing the way that the entire Canadian government is like formed right now, like kind of reframing the Constitution?
Yes, absolutely. So I think if you really want to protect Indigenous peoples from the machinations of, contemporary politics, we should constitutionalize those two rights: the right of veto and the right to a fixed percentage of GDP annually. So I think that ultimately, if a right-wing government comes into power, it would be too easy for them to either curtail those rights or eliminate them altogether. But secondly, I think we need to get rid of this notion of the crown. It's something which deeply bothers me, that this colonial institution, profoundly racist institution, that the head of that institution is still technically Canada's head of state. So I think we should get rid of the crown altogether, have an elected head of state, and just cleanse our country of the dross and refuse of the colonial era and the institutions which created so much suffering and injustice for Indigenous peoples.
Thank you. Those are some big goals.
Yeah, that's a real tough one, obviously. Amending the Constitution is a huge battle, but we can start with legislation.
That's true. That's true. We can work towards it. Are there any more questions? Okay, I shall move on to the next topic: structural racism and gender-based discrimination. As an eco-socialist, what is the relationship between racial justice, social justice, environmental justice, and economic justice?
That's a big question. Well,
very big,
yeah.
But you have a lot of time.
Well, I think I'm going to give you a short answer. The relationship is that they are all fundamentally caused by the same thing, which is the capitalist economic order, in my view. So unless and until we replace this system with one that is truly humane and sustainable, we will continue to see all those forms of social injustice. And we will not solve the climate crisis or the other ecological crises that we confront. I think once we understand that, then the path forward is very clear, but achieving the goal is, of course, a Herculean task, because the people who profit from this terribly unjust economic system will fight tooth and nail and employ every weapon at their disposal to prevent the replacement of that system.
How does capitalism perpetuate the oppression of racialized and intersectionally disadvantaged groups?
Well, creating prejudice towards segments of our population facilitates their exploitation. So if a large segment of the population believes, for example, that Black persons or Indigenous persons, other racialized groups, are inferior or less deserving of the dignity, the rights of whites, then it's going to be easier for capitalists to get away with exploiting them. Whereas if they are generally viewed as being equally deserving of the benefits of democracy, equally deserving of a dignified life, of the essentials of well-being, the material essentials of well-being, it's going to be much harder for them to be exploited. And so racism is actually, as I mentioned, it's a very significant tool that allows for the ongoing exploitation of large segments of the population by the capitalist class. I hope I answered your question.
Yes. And if there are any other questions, people will have time to ask them more. What do you see as the fundamental pathways to eradicating structural racism and heteropatriarchy in this country?
Oh, wow.
It's a big one.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, there's so many things we have to do to eliminate structural racism. One thing we have to do is completely replace the current system of policing with one that is profoundly different. And so, I'm in favor of defunding the police massively, demilitarizing the police, disarming the police, relying to a much greater extent upon nonviolent forms of community policing. I think that's a very important step that we have to take in order to mitigate and ultimately eliminate structural racism. Education has a very important role to play. We also have to be much more vigilant in terms of monitoring the media, because structural racism is very much present in the corporate media, and they get away very often with perpetuating stereotypes of racialized groups, often in very insidious ways, which promotes and perpetuates structural racism. We have to lift people out of poverty, and obviously racialized groups have historically suffered from poverty to a far greater degree than non-racialized groups. So we have to ensure that all members of society, particularly those from racialized groups, have good housing, that they have access to an education, post-secondary and otherwise. They have access to good health care, including mental health care. And this is going to involve investment, massive amounts of investment by government at all levels to lift racialized groups out of poverty. So that's going to be very important. I think those three things, the reform of policing, education, and investment, massive investment in racialized communities by the government and state-owned enterprises is absolutely primordial to solving the problem of structural racism.
And what would you say to somebody who believes, or who would assume that they don't want their taxpayer money to go to somebody who's not paying taxes?
Well, I actually think that group constitutes a very small minority in this country.
I hope so.
To give you a sense, and I think this is just an indication of where public opinion lies in this regard, there was a poll done recently about a wealth tax. It was in November of last year. And the proposal on the table, it wasn't a particularly dramatic proposal. It was 1% of income, an annual tax of 1% on income over 1% of net worth over $20 million annually. That's a very, very, I don't want to be insulting, but it's a very modest step forward in terms of wealth redistribution. Nonetheless, it was quite interesting and encouraging to see that almost 80% of Canadians supported this. Almost 80%, and even 64% of Conservative Party supporters supported a wealth tax. The people who hate the wealth tax, or the people, or other forms of wealth redistribution, are the people who have lots of money. But fortunately, they're in the minority. So I don't think, ultimately we have to be worried about persuading the majority of our people to support a vigorous program of wealth redistribution. The challenge we confront is that the political system is in the control of the elites. That's the challenge that we confront. And to the extent that they don't like their wealth being redistributed, well, too bad. We live in a democracy, and you can't have democracy with these levels of inequality.
That is true. Thank you. I'd now like to open the floor to anybody who has any questions regarding this topic and what was just said.
Dimitri, if I may, it's David Duke here. You mentioned in response to the question about taxation that you suspected that a vanishingly small percentage of the population would have a problem of paying taxes that then are redirected to other members of the population. And certainly in the last 2 or 3 years, we've seen in the United States, for example, a growing movement among the very rich. Now, maybe it's for self-preservation purposes, or maybe they actually are waking up and discovering a social conscience, but there is a move towards the very rich indicating that they are willing to pay more taxes. And in fact, they actually do say, tax us, pass tax legislation that is fairer and more progressive than retrogressive. And yet the politicians, both in Ottawa and in Washington and elsewhere in the world, are extraordinarily reluctant to do that. Why do you think that is, when this constituency is in fact saying, at least publicly, go ahead, tax us? Is there something else going on privately, do you suspect, or is there just a lack of vision from the political class?
Well, perhaps the most famous billionaire proponent of increasing taxes on the rich is Warren Buffett. And I think he was supported in his call, I think this was during the it was during the Obama administration, that he openly called for increasing taxes on the wealthy. And I think possibly Bill Gates was also one of the billionaires who supported him in that. But I think that that is a view amongst the highest income earners, the wealthiest members of our society, that is a minority. I think the vast majority of them are fiercely opposed to forms of taxation. The vast majority of them want to see their taxes reduced. And I think that, the people who run the Liberal Party and the Conservative Party in this country, they know that there may be a few exceptions amongst the elites in terms of, their views about increasing taxes on the wealthy. But by and large, the elites do not want to see their taxes increased. And, even in the case of Warren Buffett, I suspect that Mr. Buffett, he wouldn't mind seeing his having to pay a very modest wealth tax, having to pay a higher tax rate on his income. But if you actually took enough money away from him so that he was no longer a billionaire, which, by the way, was something that we championed in our campaign. We called for an absolute cap on wealth accumulation, and is a very high cap, in my opinion, of $500 million. And our proposal was anybody who earns $1 above that cap would have to pay 100% tax on gains above the cap. And, I think the vast majority of wealthy people, including Mr. Buffett, would be adamantly opposed to that kind of a wealth redistribution, a real wealth redistribution, not the kind of modest thing which he probably has in mind. But again, I really, having interacted with a lot of wealthy people in the course of my legal career on Wall Street, I think that the views that Buffett has expounded on that topic constitute a minority amongst the wealthy people in our country.
Thank you. That's a sobering assessment, but thank you very much.
I see Katie Winters has her hand raised.
Yeah, it's actually Katie's boyfriend, Ben, here. Can I ask a question?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. I agree, and I really think these are all like great ideas and great ways to go about solving, climate crisis and wealth inequality in our society. My question becomes, though, if the capitalists control the government, they control the media, the state, the military, the police, how do we get these policies into power when they're so against it, when they control all of these? And as you rightfully pointed out, we don't really have that democracy. Mm-hmm. I guess the really famous example, referring back to maybe Salvador Allende's Chile in the 1970s, of where, this Marxist was elected in the government, but after only 2 or 3 years of trying to enact, I think, very similar policies, land redistribution in the countryside, nationalization of a lot of the key industries, ultimately was deposed in a coup, where the military bombed the presidential palace and installed Augusto Pinochet. So my question is, what does the path to getting towards a lot of these policies look like in Canada for you?
Yeah, so I think it's certainly fair to say that revolutionary movements have failed more often than they have succeeded, that socialist movements have tended to fail. But I think there are promising signs. So, for example, there was a coup in Bolivia last year, a right-wing coup. And, due to public pressure, both domestic and international pressure, elections were held again in Bolivia. And the party of Evo Morales was swept back to power and has now arrested the leaders of the coup government. I think, recently we saw that Lula in Brazil, I wouldn't say that Lula is necessarily a socialist, he's more of a social democrat. But nonetheless, it was quite astonishing to see that the Supreme Court of Brazil overturned his bogus convictions for corruption, which disqualified him from running against Bolsonaro, and that he's now apparently free to run again. And I think there's a very good prospect that he will be able to remove Bolsonaro, a far-right fascist, from power. Venezuela, not a perfect experiment in socialism, but under Chavez, it moved in a socialist direction quite decidedly. And it has managed to preserve, to a significant degree, the victories of Chavismo, despite extraordinary economic pressure. So, of course, the country is suffering enormously from the sanctions that are being imposed by Western states, but there's success, some degree of success. But it's true. It's true that more often than not, socialist movements or revolutionary movements fail ultimately, even though they may have some short-term successes. I think ultimately what needs to happen is that people have to come together and inflict economic pain on the ruling class. And so I've been a big proponent of general strikes. I think we need a series of general strikes that brings the economy to its knees. And it's no easy thing to organize them. It's certainly no easy thing to sustain them. But I think that is the surest path towards the kinds of radical change that we desperately need in order to save our planet and have some semblance of a democracy in the world. And there are signs that that's going to happen. I mean, the level of discontent that we're seeing amongst the populace and the increasing levels of support for socialist agendas. I talked about or socialist programs or initiatives like the wealth tax. There was a poll done last year which showed that a majority of people have a positive view of socialism in this country. There was a poll done last year which showed that a slight majority of Canadians support defunding the police. 10, 15, 20 years ago, I think it would have been unthinkable to have that there would be majority support for these things. People are becoming radicalized because they see they see what lies ahead. And at the end of the tunnel, there ain't no light, given our current trajectory. There's only suffering and ultimately potentially extinction for our species and countless others. So people are becoming radicalized, and I think ultimately we may see the kind of massive conservative collective disruptions that we need to the economy in order to finally force the elites to do what is necessary to democratize our society and save our planet. What I just want to add that, I think an important part of that is electoral politics, but electoral politics, for all of the reasons you articulated and we've been discussing, in and of themselves will never, I think, I don't want to sound too skeptical, but very unlikely that in and of themselves, they will result in the kind of radical change we need. I think we have to combine that with civil disobedience, peaceful civil disobedience on a massive scale that causes persistent, sustained economic disruption.
Max?
Hi. So you talked just a little bit ago about how there are there's a good deal of Canadians that support socialism now. But I mean, although you say that, there's nobody has a patent on socialism, there are visions within that word which are kind of antithetical. Like some would be a reformist version of capitalism, like in Sweden or something, like where there's a welfare state, but it's still essentially capitalist. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to ask you, what's your view on, I guess this is in a similar vein, but what's your view on reform versus revolution? Because there are, or versus general strike, however you want to phrase it, because there's a point of view that says that, for example, FDR was the greatest thing that could have ever happened to capitalism because he saved it amidst the Great Depression when there was a genuinely radical tenor. Do you think that reform can get in the way of an actual leftist movement?
Oh, well, there's no question, given historical experience, that a truly revolutionary movement, one of the weapons that will be deployed against it by the elites is to co-opt it and to infiltrate it. And ultimately, as has to some degree happened with the environmental movement, make it compatible with the capitalist system and preservation of the capitalist system. That's going to be, any revolutionary movement is going to confront that type of an obstacle. I think the way to sustain support for a truly revolutionary and socialist program is to talk to people about how, practically speaking, a socialist organization of our society economy will affect them. So, for example, people, when they think about socialism, not all people, I think fewer and fewer people, but because of the experience of the Soviet Union and the way the Soviet Union was portrayed, with some justification to Western voters during the time that it was in place, people have a view of a socialist society as being very top-down, where power is highly centralized. People's oppression, the oppressor is simply replaced, the capitalist is replaced, by a socialist or a communist dictator. So they have this view, but when you begin to explain to people, so for example, what I think socialism truly is a democratized workplace, amongst other things, not a mass of state-owned enterprises whose workers are being told what to do by a central government. And if people were actually, invited to imagine what their day-to-day lives would be like, again, this is something Richard Wolff talks about. He said people go to work 5 days a week. One day of their work their work week would be devoted to getting together with their fellow workers, debating and making decisions about the operation of the workplace, both long-term and short-term decisions about the operation of the workplace. And people begin to think about this like, wow, one of the 5 days I spend in work, I'm actually going to be deciding how to organize the workplace and how the compensation is going to be distributed and what we're going to produce and what our hours of work are. That's amazing. I think a huge proportion of workers out there today would get on board with the truly socialist agenda if we help them to understand what that actually looks like. So revolution is possible, but a precondition to it is enlightenment and helping people to understand what the revolution is ultimately trying to achieve, and that what we want to achieve is practicably ascertainable or achievable. So it's a long-term process. Chomsky talks about this a lot. Revolutions generally do not happen overnight. Social justice doesn't prevail in the course of a few protests. The fight can go on for decades, even centuries. Unfortunately, we have the problem now that the climate crisis has, forced us to have to act relatively quickly by historical standards. But these are battles that can be won and that will be won if we engage with our fellow citizens to really help them to understand what it is that we as socialists are trying to achieve and what our society would look like if we succeeded.
Thank you. I will move on to the next topic if there aren't any more questions. Okay. The next topic, which is the Middle East and foreign policy. Foreign policy is an area where you shine. You were given an A by the Canadians for justice and peace in the Middle East and independent Jewish voices in their assessment of Green Party leadership candidates, the highest mark of any candidate. You have voiced your opposition to the Saudi regime, the demonization of Evo Morales in Bolivia, and the overblown Western rhetoric around China. How did a Green become so invested in foreign policy? And how do we collectively struggle against militarism and the US imperialism?
It's true that I care deeply about foreign policy and I talk a lot about foreign policy. I think that really isn't something that comes out of my activities within the Green Party. It comes out of my own personal experience. So my parents came to this country in the 1950s. They were born in the 1930s in Greece during the Depression. They then lived through as children a brutal Nazi occupation. The Nazis, this is something that I learned at a very young age, but not through my parents who didn't like to talk about it too much, but just by investigating myself, my own heritage and the history of my own family. During the Second World War and this extraordinarily brutal occupation that the Nazis inflicted upon Greece and other countries, the most effective forces of resistance were those of the communists. And when the Nazis were ultimately expelled, the communists were in by far the best position to actually assume power, to fill the power vacuum in the country. And Churchill at the time did a deal with Stalin that effectively consigned Greece to the Anglo-American sphere of influence. The West, led by Churchill, agreed to leave Balkan states to the Soviet Union. So having struck that deal with Stalin, what the Americans, and particularly the British, then did was they sided with the monarchists, with the fascists, because there were Nazi collaborators in Greece amongst the Greek population, with the far right, other right-wing groups, and they waged a civil war against the communist movement, which is on the brink of power in the country, and left the country in absolute devastation. So my parents, after having lived through the Depression, the Second World War, the occupation, and finally the Civil War, they were presented with an opportunity to come to Canada when the Canadian government set up a program to sponsor people coming from Southern Europe to do menial work in Canada. And they arrived in the Maritimes, actually, on a boat from Europe in the 1950s, and then they took a train and ended up in Southern Ontario. And as I was growing up, I myself, but the level of racism and bigotry that I experienced was a pittance compared to what racialized groups like Indigenous persons, Black persons, and other groups in this country have experienced. But I actually experienced that myself in the 1960s when I was being raised. I remember an older man who was a security guard at a shopping mall. He referred to my family as Greek scum. I was 5 years old, and he said that to me. So all of these things help me to become very sensitive to international affairs and the way in which injustice crosses borders and can be influenced by events beyond our borders. And ultimately, we as a country, what I've come to learn in my life, and that was just the beginning of a process of personal enlightenment for me, what I've come to believe is that we cannot have democracy domestically. We cannot have a sustainable planet domestically. We can't have a society free of racism domestically unless the whole world has been freed of these scourges. It's a myth. It's a complete illusion. The idea that we can seal ourselves off from the rest of humanity and have some kind of ideal society while injustice rages elsewhere. And I think the environment is a perfect example of this. You know, greenhouse gas emissions don't respect borders. So we can do everything within our power to eliminate our own greenhouse gas emissions, but if other countries aren't doing that, we're doomed. So we have to understand that foreign policy is as important to our well-being and the well-being of humanity generally as domestic policy. It's absolutely critical, and that really is something, as I say, I learned at a very young age. And so that's why I invest so much time and energy in foreign policy, and sometimes I'm actually chastised by some Greens for doing that. You know, we should be focusing on our problems here at home. If Greens should understand anything, it is that these injustices and the threats that confront us are of an international nature. They can only be resolved through international cooperation.
Okay, thank you. You're an outspoken critic of Israeli apartheid and a strong supporter of BDS, which stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions, and the Palestinian Liberation, for which you've frequently been labeled anti-Semitic for. Can you speak about what is at stake for Palestinians currently living under such settler colonial military occupation, and also the geopolitics of Israel upholding Western imperial interests in the region?
Yeah, so this is a cause, certainly true, to which I've devoted a lot of my energy. I was always, not always, but I would say well before I became really active in the Palestinian Solidarity Movement, which started in 2016, I was quite appalled by the way the Palestinian people were being treated, but this was not a significant activity for me. What really turned my thinking about this was in 2016, I went to Israel, not to investigate what was being done to Palestinians. I went there because I was working on a class action at the time, which required me to go there and interview some witnesses, some people who had been used as slave labor in Eritrea by a Canadian gold mining company. And just so you know, the name of that company is Nevson, okay? And these people, some of these slave laborers had escaped Eritrea and had ended up in Tel Aviv. So I went there and I conducted some interviews of the victims of these atrocities. And then I was invited to the West Bank by a Canadian Palestinian whom I had met in London, Ontario, named Rahab Nazal, a Palestinian Canadian artist. And Rahab took me on a tour of the West Bank. And I'd been there before. I've been to the West Bank 4 times, but I hadn't been there in a long time. And the last time I had been there, my politics weren't quite as left-wing as they have become. So she took me to Hebron. She took me to Bethlehem. She took me to the countryside, to villages which had been almost completely cut off from other Palestinian communities by the apartheid wall. And when I left there, I tell you, I came home. I spent a week going through the West Bank with her. And when I came home, I was so disturbed by what I saw that I was having trouble sleeping. I was actually having nightmares. And I thought, what am I going to do? I just have felt absolutely, it was a moral imperative that I do something. At the time, I was in the shadow cabinet of the Green Party, and we were about to have our biannual convention. So I decided to bring forward a policy resolution calling for the party to support the use of boycott, divestment, and sanctions to bring an end to the occupation. And then all hell broke loose. And for the first time in my life, I'd never had to confront these allegations before. I was being accused of anti-Semitism because I supported the BDS movement. I was shocked. I couldn't believe that people were accusing me of this, but that is the price one pays in this country, unfortunately, for demanding that Israel be held accountable. So personally, for me, that's how it started. And, I'm often asked, well, why, quite apart from your own, personal reaction to what you saw in the West Bank, which is just undeniably a system of apartheid. It's so obvious that it's an apartheid system that it's remarkable that we even have to have a debate about it anymore. But it goes beyond what I saw with my own eyes and how it affected me. My government, the government that purports to speak in my name and that spends my tax dollars and your tax dollars in order to implement its foreign policies, it is as complicit in the suffering of the Palestinian people as any government in the world, with the exception of Israel's own government. Our government, Lester B. Pearson and former Supreme Court Justice Ivan Rand played a key role in the unjust partition of Palestine. Our government allows settlement products to be imported into this country. The settlements, the government recognizes, our own government has recognized for decades that they're a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, yet it allows, and they're a war crime, by the way, yet it allows those products not only to be imported into this country, but to be imported into this country bearing product of Israel labels, even though they're actually being produced on stolen Palestinian land. Our government gives charitable status to the Canadian branch of the Jewish National Fund, which controls 13% of the land in Israel approximately, and explicitly discriminates against Palestinians in the allocation of land. Our government trades in arms with Israel. Our government has a free trade agreement in Israel, which it deepened. In 2018, only 3 weeks, it entered into an enhanced free trade agreement with Israel, only 3 weeks after an Israeli sniper shot a Canadian citizen, Dr. Tarek Loubani, in the Great March of Return in Gaza. He was in the field to tend to wounded civilians who were being gunned down by Israeli snipers, and they shot him. How did our government respond? By awarding to Israel's government a deeper trade relationship. So I, as a Canadian, we as Canadians, we have our priority in terms of justice and human rights should be to address those human rights crises in which our own government is most complicit, and to address the human rights crises which the corporate media are ignoring. Why do I need to add my voice to the human rights abuses that are being committed in places like Russia or China and Iran? The Canadian population is being constantly told about human rights abuses in these countries. What I should be focusing my efforts on, what I should be lending my voice to, are the victims of injustice who are being ignored by the establishment in this country. And so that's really a big part of the reason why I have devoted as much time and energy as I have to the Palestinian cause.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to open the floor to any questions that anybody might have at this point. All right. Well, if there are no questions, I'll move on to our final topic, politics. What is the role of parliamentary politics in addressing the issue of capitalism, the climate crisis, decolonization, structural discrimination, and neo-imperialism just laid out?
Politics is absolutely essential to dealing with all of those phenomena, all of those injustices. Because ultimately, in order for us to eliminate racism from our society, in order for us to eliminate poverty, to eliminate homelessness, to eliminate any form of bigotry, any form of injustice, we have to have the power to make laws. We have to have the power to modify the regulatory regimes. We also have to have the power to put in charge of our regulators people who are both capable and who have the political will to achieve the broad objectives of the regulatory regime that we have entrusted them with. So we have to gain political power ultimately in order to solve all of these crises. But the current political system ain't going to do it for you. It's not. And to me, like the most, just the most amazing example of this is we saw the proof of it just weeks ago when the NDP brought forward a motion in favor of the wealth tax. This modest, puny little wealth tax of 1% annually on estates in excess of $20 million. As I indicated, 89, I don't know if I said this, 89% of Liberal Party supporters support this wealth tax. 64% of Conservative Party supporters support this wealth tax. The Conservatives and the Liberals were overwhelmingly opposed to this resolution. It was not even a binding resolution. It wasn't a law. It was just a non-binding resolution. They fiercely opposed it. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that they do not serve the interests of their supposed constituents. They are not going to deal with the needs of the people. It doesn't matter what level of support there may be for a program of wealth redistribution, any other socially just program that is fiercely opposed by the elites. It doesn't matter how much popular support there is. They will ultimately side with the elites. So that's where, you know, civil disobedience comes in on a massive scale. In order to make politics responsive to the needs of the people are going to have to force the hand of the politicians through constant expressions of their discontent and in ways that cause financial and economic pain to the elites themselves.
Even though you are well outside the political establishment, but how do leftist actors such as yourself make a difference within a parliamentary system that is designed to maintain the status quo? And is there some kind of tension that you feel that you face because of this position you're in?
Oh, yes. Yeah, there's no, and this is not unique to me, there's no shortage of tension confronting any socialist political candidate, and not just in Canada, but throughout the West. You see what happened to Jeremy Corbyn. Jeremy Corbyn was absolutely, and Jeremy Corbyn is not the most radical politician in the West. He is, you know, I think he is in good faith a socialist, a lifelong anti-racist, but his program wasn't actually that radical. And look what happened. He was absolutely vilified. Look what happened to Bernie Sanders. You know, Bernie Sanders, the Democratic establishment, twice, basically, in my opinion, stole the nomination from him, conspired against him. He was actually ahead of the pack as soon as he got in a position in his most recent attempt to get the Democratic nomination for president. Again, we're not dealing with somebody who's particularly radical here. He's a social democrat, Bernie Sanders. What happened? All the other establishment candidates dropped out within a matter of days and threw their support behind Joe Biden. Joe Biden, who supported the Iraq war. Joe Biden, who is opposed to Medicare for all. Joe Biden, who promised a $15 minimum wage, a livable wage, and broke his promise within months of becoming president of the United States. This is the man behind whom they rallied. So every single person who has even a moderately socialist agenda to advance is going to confront extreme hostility from the establishments. You know, what I was hoping to accomplish, you know, I believed from the outset that I was going to encounter hostility, and it took me 3 months to decide to get into the race last year because I knew it was going to be ugly, and I just was dreading it. But ultimately, I thought if somehow we can win, and I can get a seat in Parliament as the leader of the Green Party of Canada, you know, a parliamentary seat is a bully pulpit, and it's much harder for the media to ignore you in this country if you are the leader of a political party that has a presence in Parliament. And so what I was hoping to do if I could win was actually to stand up in Parliament and say the things that no other parliamentarian is willing to say. And my belief is that that would, in and of itself, generate an amazing national conversation about the things that we're typically ignoring and we need to desperately pay attention to.
Thank you. That would be very interesting to see.
Yeah.
Once again, bringing it back to students, what role can we play as students, young youth of a country, besides voting, which is being encouraged right now, but what else can we do?
Civil disobedience.
Our government.
Yeah, civil disobedience. It's the number one thing you can do. Absolutely. You have to lead the charge. You know, I have two children, you know, they're 21 and 22 years old now. And, you know, the most painful thing for me as a father is to imagine the world in which they are going to live if current trends persist, once I am gone and I'm no longer there or able to protect them. And the young people of this world, due to the failings of my generation and prior generations, confront a grim future, and they are the ones who are ultimately going to gain control over the affairs of state. They have to take the lead, and we, those of us who are part of a generation that failed, have to do everything we can to support them. But they have to lead the charge in terms of civil disobedience and disruption. So that's the number one thing you can do. And number 2 and 3.
Noted. I'd like to open up the floor right now to any questions, not just regarding the current topic about politics, but also any other questions that you might have. Because we have gone through all our prepared questions.
May I ask a question?
Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Is that me?
Yes.
Hi, Dimitri. How are you?
Great, Judy. How you doing?
I don't even think I have to ask the question because you know what I want to ask about. But you came so close to winning that Green Party election. You developed an incredible following. What's next, Dimitri, for you and us who wish to continue to support your viewpoint and your efforts to get into the political atmosphere and get into Parliament?
Well, right now, the core members of my campaign team, and by the way, I want to say this is not false humility. It's what I absolutely 100% believe. I don't think people supported me as a candidate because of the person that I am. I think that was at best a secondary reason. What they supported was our platform. They supported the substantive socialist policies that we put forward. That's what got people excited. And that set of policies was not, I did not dictate them. What we did in our campaign was we set up a platform committee in which over the course of the campaign, I think something like 15 or 20 persons participated. The platform committee was chaired by Professor Radhika Desai from the University of Manitoba, who's a political economist and a socialist. We had amazing people on that platform committee. And what they would do is they would consult with me at a very high level about, policy issues, but ultimately they wrote the platform. And people were so excited by that, not the candidate, but by that we decided after getting so close to winning that we had to continue to advocate for those policies in some organized way. So the core members of my campaign team, is about 10 of us, we're setting up an organization called the Green Left, which is going to be a national organization designed to promote an eco-socialist platform at all levels of government from coast to coast in Canada. And it's open to people who aren't Greens. We're going to invite in people who are not affiliated with any political party, people from the NDP, left-leaning members of the Liberals. If conservatives suddenly decide they want to support socialist policies, even they could join the Green Left. But ultimately, what we are trying to do is to build upon the momentum of the campaign and continue to educate people about this policy platform, which got us so close to victory. And ultimately, our goal is not to form a new political party. Our goal is to transform the existing political parties that have a progressive inclination. But if that project fails, ultimately this may one day morph into a political party.
Good luck.
Thank you very much. And you're all welcome to join once we launch in the next few weeks, and I encourage you to do that.
Good to hear that.
Thank you, Judy. Great to see you again.
Thank you for all the work that you've done. And as you know, my special interest is Palestinian human rights, and you've just been an incredible leader in that area. And thank you so much for that, Dimitri.
Well, let me thank Independent Jewish Voices Canada, because so much of what we've accomplished and the stuff I've been involved with, we couldn't have done without IJV. Just couldn't have done it. Like the battle over the BDS resolution in the Green Party.
Oh, yeah.
The role JV played in that was absolutely critical, amongst many other initiatives. So thank you, Judy. You guys are doing great work.
Are there any more questions?
Yeah, I have one for you, Dimitri.
Hi, Max.
I wanted to ask you who your favorite, like academic or I guess like political kind of hero, someone who really inspired you to sort of adopt the views that you do, who kind of shaped the way that you think about politics. Yeah, I was just wondering who was formative for you in kind of in creating your viewpoints.
I would say I got asked this during the campaign, actually. I think really 3 or 4 figures have had a profound impact on me. Noam Chomsky is definitely one of them. Another one would be Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, and Mahatma Gandhi. I think that they were, they should be an exemplar for all those who aspire to be politically active.
Thank you. And if you were to recommend some required reading for the Acadia Communist Club, what would you suggest?
The book I always suggest first and foremost, for I'm sure many of your members will have already read it, is Manufacturing Consent by Noam Chomsky. Another wonderful book, even though it's focused on the United States, it's really an eye-opener, is People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. I think that's an amazing book. That should keep you busy for a while. Those are 2 big, thick books.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any more questions?
I have a question.
Yes, I see a hand up. Please go ahead.
I don't have a hand up. My hand function is not working right now. It's Michael Dennis.
Hi, Michael.
Do you mind if I go ahead?
Yes.
Hi, Dimitri. Terrific talk. Really interesting. Very stimulating and thought-provoking, particularly on the whole question of the general strike and the notion of civil disobedience. From my understanding, however, general strikes really depend on organization at the grassroots. As you acknowledge in your talk, they're not spontaneous affairs. They build upon grassroots organizing. They build upon sort of local mobilization, working through organizations. So what would that look like today? I mean, if one kind of agrees that the current kind of working class movement, the union movement, is in many senses moribund, what would that look like? I mean, organizationally speaking, in terms of mobilization, what institutions, what organizations, what kind of tactics that would go beyond, an Occupy Wall Street and effectively, sort of channel, if you will, these grievances into a kind of significant opposition.
Well, you're absolutely right. This is a tall order, a general strike, and laying out a path to being able to mount a general strike organizationally and sustain them. That's a big, complex question. I'll confine myself because of the limited time available to us to sort of a couple of observations. I think first of all you have to demonstrate the effectiveness of economic and social disruption as a tactic on a local level. And once you do that, once people see, so for example, you want to change the direction of a municipal government. Let's start within communities using economic and disruption in order to force the hand of municipal politicians to adopt a much more progressive agenda. Demonstrate to people that this is actually an effective tactic. Another, just again, a big picture observation is that the left is highly factional, highly sectarian. And I'm sometimes amazed at how sectarian it can be. I'll tell you like a story that's personal to me. During the course of the campaign last year, I was a member of Socialist Action, and I joined the organization, I think, a couple of years ago. I'm also a member of Democratic Socialists of Canada. I'm a member of Courage. I'm a member of Progressive International. What I try to do, and what I think we as leftist activists should do, is build bridges to our allies within the leftist community. Socialist Action, however, was so distraught by the fact that I was running to be the leader of the Green Party, which they regarded as an eco-capitalist party, that wasn't, as they put it, organically linked to labor, that they issued to me an ultimatum. The ultimatum was that I either withdraw from the leadership contest or that I be expelled from socialist action. So they, of course, I declined the invitation to withdraw from the leadership contest, and they expelled me. And then afterwards, as a matter of fact, just last night, they invited me. They said, no hard feelings, Dimitri, would you come and speak to us about defunding the police? And I said, sure, I'm happy to speak to you about defunding the police, because I think what we should all be trying to do as leftists is build bridges to our allies and put an end to the sectarianism and the infighting on the left. I'm sure there's lots of that on the right, by the way. I don't think that this is peculiar to the left. It's just that the right has all the power, so it's more important for us on the left to be united than it is for the people on the right. We don't have the wealthy behind us, they do. Once we begin to do that, we build bridges to organizations across the country, grassroots organizations, people who not necessarily perfectly ideologically aligned with us, will be better positioned in order to launch something as ambitious as a national general strike. We got a lot of work to do to get there, no doubt about it. And I couldn't even within the space of 5 minutes tell you what that plan would look like, because it's a complex undertaking, to be sure.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Any more? There's a hand up.
Hi,
Hi, Linda.
Congratulations on your amazing showing with the Green Party leadership. I run an amazing campaign. I have a question. With your involvement with as a journalist, are there any particular media outlets or journalists that you would trust to give a fair and balanced reporting?
Sure. Organizations like in Canada, these are small media outlets, obviously, because they're viewer supported, but they're doing far better work journalistically than the major media organizations, to be sure. Rabble is a good media outlet, Ricochet Media, Canadian Dimension, although I currently have some issues editorially with Canadian Dimension, which I won't get into. There's a very interesting new media organization being launched called The Breach. They just announced several weeks ago that they launched, and they've begun soliciting donations, and that's going to include Pam Pomater, Avi Lewis, Linda McQuaig is going to write for them. I believe Eve Engler is going to be writing for them. So I'm very intrigued to see what they will do. I used to be, south of the border, a fan of The Intercept. I thought they were doing great work. Unfortunately, they've gravitated towards the dreaded center, and to such a degree that Glenn Greenwald, who I think is arguably the greatest journalist alive today, he left the organization. So sadly, I think The Intercept is in decline. And of course, there's the Real News. I sit on the board of the Real News, and I it would be remiss of me if I didn't mention them. So those are some of them. But one thing I will say as a general proposition, if you want to know what's happening in the world, especially if you have a left-wing perspective, you need just avoid the corporate media like the plague, other than to just apprise yourself of what they're saying. It is important to know what they're saying to the populace, but don't rely upon them for information. Go to the independent, not-for-profit media. That's where you'll really be given the information you need to decipher what's happening to our world.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Yes. I see another hand. Carol?
Hi, Dimitri. This whole idea of civil disobedience is really interesting. I mean, revolution, I think, is where it's at. And recently, we've seen we saw something spark with the pipeline protests. We saw a movement where Canadians joined the fray in large numbers and caused some difficulty for the government. So I just would love your sense of kind of how we can, if there are movements as well. I know you talk about forming these bridges, but You know, what was it in that movement, do you think? What was going on there that really captivated Canadians and really moved them to be involved, to take action in a way that I haven't seen for some time?
I just think the accumulated hypocrisy of our government and our corporate sector over decades of lying to Indigenous communities and lying to the Canadian public about what's being done to Indigenous communities just caused an eruption of anger. And I think that, frankly, I would say the same thing about the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think to a degree, the powers that be were saved by the pandemic. Those two movements, they're certainly not gone. They're still out there. But I think that they were of necessity, their efforts were muted and were constrained by the conditions of the pandemic. Once we resolve this pandemic, I think all hell may break loose, because the situation's gotten worse. You know, the wealth of the wealthiest Canadians has gone up by tens of billions of dollars, while millions of Canadians are wallowing in poverty. Tens of thousands of people are living in homelessness, and the economic duress of the least advantaged members of our society has been exacerbated by the pandemic. So, and Occupy Wall Street, which was, that's what really radicalized me. Was, I took part in, I was down in Zuccotti Park in New York City, for a weekend, about 2 days before the cops came in and just brutally suppressed and cleared out Zuccotti Park. There was a coordinated effort across North America, using the police, municipal police forces, to snuff out the Occupy Wall Street movement, but it never actually went away. It just morphed into other movements, including the Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of people who were active in Occupy Wall Street became active in Black Lives Matter, became active in Idle No More, participated in the solidarity protests for the Wet'suwet'en people. So these social forces, this level of popular indignation is on the rise. And I think that once we emerge from this pandemic, there will never be a better time to mobilize the forces of social justice to create that level of disruption that we need. I don't, that's not really a practical prescription for how to do it, but I just want to highlight the opportunity that I think exists out there.
Okay. We have time to take one more question, if there is one more final question. But if not, thank you so much for talking to us and sharing us about your perspectives and views on all these heavy topics. I myself, as an international student, really learned a lot. Yeah, it's very interesting to see how other countries' governments work and what people's perspectives and opinions are on how well their government is doing for their people is. So I appreciated the honor. Thank you.
Your questions were excellent and quite difficult, frankly. So thank you for that.
You'll have to thank the Communist Club for that. Yes.
It's a pleasure speaking to you all, really. And happy to do it again anytime.
Thank you so much, Dimitri. We appreciate it.
All right. Take care, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.